My name is Lucas Hall. I'm 34 years old. I live in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I'm going to tell a story that happened with my family almost 6 years ago. At that time, we were in an underground refuge that my family had used for generations to protect ourselves from disasters. I never thought anything so strange and terrifying could happen in a place where we always felt safe. I can't really explain what happened there, but the feeling of fear and the impact of that night still haunt me to this day. That night, everything seemed normal. A strong storm was approaching, and as always, my family prepared to spend the night in the bunker. The place is simple, an underground building that my grandfather had built over 50 years ago. He always said that safety came first, so during any kind of natural disaster or even external threats, we were supposed to stay there. Since I was a kid, I had heard stories about the bunker, but I never thought much about it. It was just a shelter. My wife, Melissa, and our 2 kids, a 9-year-old girl and a 7-year-old boy, went there. The storm was getting worse with lightning and strong winds outside, but inside the bunker, we felt safe. Everything was calm, until something happened that we couldn't understand. Hours had passed since we locked ourselves in the bunker. We were all sitting, trying to stay calm. The radio battery was failing, and the flashlights were flickering a bit, but nothing too alarming. Melissa was playing with the kids, trying to keep them distracted. That's when the first strange things started to happen. First, I noticed that the lights in the room started flickering irregularly, like there was a short circuit. The thing is, the bunker didn't have electricity connected to the external grid, so it was impossible for the lights to be working. Still, they would turn on and off by themselves. I went over to the control panel, but everything was disconnected. When I returned to the room, I heard a whisper, a soft sound, barely perceptible, but enough to make me stop. I looked at Melissa and the kids, but they didn't hear anything. I was starting to think I was imagining things, but then the sound became clearer. It was a whisper, louder this time, as if someone was speaking very softly, but at the same time, it sounded like the voice was distorting in the air. I walked over to the wall where the sound seemed to come from and put my hand on it. The surface was cold, but there was nothing strange about the wall itself. At first, I thought it was the wind from the storm outside, but then I heard it again. A whisper, louder now, as if someone was speaking to me. I went to the nearest wall, where the sound seemed to come from, and put my hand on it. The surface was cold, but there was nothing strange about the wall itself. At first, I thought it was the wind from the storm outside, but then I heard it again. A whisper, louder now, as if someone was speaking to me. My wife started to notice I was tense and asked if everything was okay. I didn't know what to say, so I told her it was just the wind, but honestly, I didn't believe it. Melissa looked at me suspiciously, but went back to playing with the kids. When I went back into the center of the room, one of my kids, my oldest, asked if I was hearing that. That was the sound coming from the walls. He seemed so calm, as if it were a normal thing, like music playing from somewhere far off. But the truth was, no one else should have been there. When I looked at the wall again, I saw that the lights were on again, more intense, as if something had been activated. Suddenly, a light came on at the end of the hallway. The hallway had no reason to have power. I looked at Melissa and saw that she was starting to look more unsettled, but she didn't know what to do either. She was with the kids now, and I felt like I should protect them, but I didn't know how. The lights in the bunker started flickering faster, and the whisper now seemed to be all around me. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight. Something was trying to control me or drive me crazy. I remember at that moment, something else happened. I saw a reflection of something in the glass of the bunker window. It wasn't a clear image, but it looked like a figure, a shadow that moved and disappeared. I looked at Melissa and saw that she was getting more agitated, but I didn't know what to do. She was with the kids now, and I felt like I should protect them, but I didn't know how. The lights in the bunker started to flicker faster, and the whisper now seemed to be all around me. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight. Something was trying to control me or drive me crazy. The lights in the bunker started flickering faster, and the whispers now seemed to surround us. I froze, unable to speak. The sensation was overwhelming, like we weren't alone. like something was in there with us. My children had gone completely still, their eyes wide as if they too could sense it. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but the fear that had settled deep in my chest wouldn't go away. I had to get out, but we were stuck down there, deep underground. I tried to stay calm, but the atmosphere of the place had changed. It felt wrong. I finally decided we needed to leave somehow. I grabbed my lanterns and tried the radio again, but it was dead. The sound was growing louder. I couldn't breathe properly. And then, in the peak of panic, the whisper stopped. There was a silence. The deepest silence I've ever heard. For a moment, I thought it was over, but the truth is, I didn't know what had just happened. I didn't know if it was real or if our minds were playing tricks on us. All I know is that when the storm passed, the lights went out, and when we finally went upstairs to the outside, the feeling that something had stayed with me never left. We never went back to that place. My name is Ryan, I'm 32 years old, and I live in a small town in rural Iowa. My family has always lived in this house, an old building but well maintained. I've grown up here, and despite it being large and somewhat isolated, I never thought of it as a haunted house or anything like that. But what happened that summer night, during a storm that seemed to last forever, changed everything I thought I knew about the place. The rain was heavy, beating against the windows, making a sound almost soothing. The kind of storm that makes you want to stay indoors, watch movies, and forget about the world outside. But for some reason, that night was different. The sound of the rain seemed muffled, as if something was blocking the natural sound. The noise, no matter how loud it was, seemed to be coming from inside the house, not from outside. I didn't think much of it at first, but when my mom mentioned that she was hearing the same strange sound, a chill ran down my spine. We decided to investigate. My dad, being the type of person who thinks everything has a logical explanation, grabbed a flashlight and started searching the house. I went with him while my mom and my younger sister Emily stayed in the living room, trying to make sense of what we were hearing. As we passed the hallway leading to the basement, the sound grew louder. It was as if it was coming from beneath the house, like the rain was falling from some hidden spot, something that couldn't be seen or understood. Our basement had always been a strange place. Old, with stone walls and full of stuff we had stored away over the years. But that night felt different. When my dad pointed the flashlight toward the back of the basement, something caught our attention. There was a part of the wall that seemed a little out of place. I can't explain how, but it looked like there was an opening, a hole covered with stones and mortar. Over the years, we had never noticed it until then. It was like that part of the wall had been forgotten on purpose. I was starting to feel uneasy, but my dad seemed determined. He started removing the stones one by one, with the flashlight shining on his face, showing a mix of curiosity and concern. When he finally removed the last stone, a deep, muffled sound emerged. It was like the air itself was being forced out of some confined space. I tried to step back, but something kept me there, like I couldn't leave until I understood what was happening. And then, the sight that appeared before us was even stranger. There, at the bottom of the well, was something that looked damp, like water had accumulated there, but the substance wasn't just water. It looked like something thicker, like something that had been trapped for a long time, waiting to be released. Somehow, I knew that it wasn't just rainwater. When my dad tried to descend into the well, something strange happened. The sound of the rain, which had already been odd, started to change. It was as if the storm was getting more intense, but not in the sky. It seemed like the noise of the rain was coming from inside the house, coming from that well. I knew something was wrong, but my dad, determined to understand, climbed down with the flashlight, and for some reason that made me want to leave. Then I heard a voice. It wasn't a clear voice, nor human, but something, older. I can't explain exactly what I heard, but I can tell you that it was something that didn't belong to our time. When I looked at my mom and Emily, I saw the same fear in their eyes. But my dad didn't seem to notice what was happening. He was too focused on trying to understand what was in the well. Suddenly, his flashlight went out, and the sound of the rain intensified even more. I could feel the humidity in the air becoming heavier, like the house itself was. absorbing the storm. I shouted for my dad, but he didn't respond. I ran to him and saw something I'll never forget. The wall of the well, which had previously been completely covered, was now starting to move on its own. It was as if something down there was trying to get out, like the well was opening up by itself. The sound of the rain now sounded like a roar. I couldn't tell anymore if it was the storm outside or something coming from inside the house. I started pulling my dad, but he was stuck, as if something was holding him there, preventing him from leaving. When I finally managed to drag him out, he seemed different. His eyes were vacant, as if he had seen something that he couldn't understand, something that left him paralyzed with fear. We ran out of the basement and rushed to close the door, trying to block the sound that seemed unwilling to stop. But the moment we closed it, the storm stopped instantly. The rain ceased to hit the windows, and a complete silence took over the house. There was no sound at all, and everything was calm. But I knew something was wrong. Something was down there, something that had stayed there, waiting for the right moment to return to the surface. To this day, we haven't been able to understand what happened that night. We never heard the sound of the rain coming from the well again. But my family was never the same after that. My dad withdrew from everyone, as if he carried a weight in his eyes, something he never spoke of again. And the worst part is that the well, that secret part of the house, was never reopened. We sealed it off and never touched that part of the basement again. To this day, I fear what might be down there, waiting, as if the rain was just a warning. I don't know what was in that well. We'll never know. But I know that it wasn't normal, and I'll never forget the sound of it trying to get out. Since that day, every time there's a summer storm, I feel a chill run down my spine, as if it's trying to come back. And honestly, I don't know if I'm prepared for what might happen if it does. My name is Brian Thompson. I'm 35 years old, and I live in a small town in the state of Arkansas. The story I'm going to tell happened 12 years ago, but to this day I still can't understand what happened that night. I can't get rid of it. Maybe writing about it will help me finally find some explanation, or maybe I just need to vent to someone who can understand. It was a typical summer evening, with heavy clouds in the sky, but nothing that made me imagine what was coming. I lived with my mom and brother in an old house that had been in the family for generations. The kind of house that you feel has history, you know? And I'm not talking about good history. Sometimes it felt like the walls had secrets, like they breathed and kept something hidden inside, as if the house had a life of its own. But that night, what happened felt like something from another world. The storm arrived suddenly, like a punch in the stomach. The first raindrops came like a thin curtain, but soon the rain was falling in torrents, and the wind howled like it wanted to tear the house off the ground. The trees outside were swaying violently, and the sound of thunder was getting louder by the second, as if the sky itself was fighting with the earth. I was sitting in the living room with my brother, trying to watch TV, but the sound of the storm was so loud that we could barely hear the TV itself. I remember my brother was worried, but I tried not to pay attention, just letting the storm's noise surround us. But soon, the power went out. The silence was terrifying for a moment. It was as if the house had stopped in time. There was no light, no sound, except for the roar of the storm outside. That's when it happened. A lightning bolt struck the house so hard that the lights flickered, and the power went out for a second. The noise was deafening, almost making me lose my breath. But the worst part was what came right after the impact. After the flash of lightning dissipated, a vibration began to ripple through the house. I felt something strange on the lower floor, like the floor was moving beneath my feet. I looked at my brother, and I could see on his face that he felt it too. That feeling that something was wrong. It was just the thunder, he said, trying to hide it, but he didn't seem convinced. Neither was I. Something was happening, something that didn't make any logical sense. In the following minutes, the walls of the house began to vibrate again. But this time the vibration was accompanied by sounds, muffled and strange sounds coming from below, from the basement. It wasn't just the noise of things falling or the wind hitting the walls. It sounded like the basement itself was trying to rearrange itself. Like something was trying to get out of there. I know it sounds crazy, but that's how it felt, as if the walls were adjusting, moving to open a path. I knew the basement was locked. It had always been locked. No one in the family had ever used that space. It was a stuffy, dark place, and my mom had always told me never to go down there. She never really explained why, but I always respected it. It was like she was scared of what might be down there, or better yet, what couldn't be. But that night I felt like something had changed. The thunder kept rumbling, louder now, as if the world was falling apart around us. Each lightning strike made the walls of the house tremble even more, and with each tremor, the sounds from the basement grew stronger. It was like the house was alive, trying to do something that was beyond my understanding. And the strangest thing of all was that after each lightning strike, it seemed like the house was trying to open something that was trapped down there. I walked up to the basement door, almost unwillingly, as if some invisible force was pushing me toward it. Fear paralyzed me, but there was also an unbearable curiosity, almost as if I was the only one who could understand what was happening or stop something worse from happening. When I put my hand on the doorknob, the metal was cold, colder than usual. But when I opened the door, what I saw inside was not what I expected. The basement looked completely different. The darkness was thick, almost tangible, and there was something in the air, a pressure, as if the space was being compressed by something invisible. I could hear the sound of wind, but it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the basement. Something was moving down there, and it didn't seem natural. I tried to take a few steps inside, but I felt a weight on my shoulders. It was like I was being stopped from going further. And that's when, from the depths of the basement, something moved. It wasn't just a shadow moving or the sound of rats. It was a movement, as if the ground itself was rearranging, like the walls were shifting. I felt a wave of panic take over me, but something made me stay there, frozen, watching the horror unfold. Each lightning strike made the walls of the basement contort even more. I don't know how to describe it without sounding insane, but it felt like the house was trying to open a portal to something that was trapped down there. Something very old, something that shouldn't be freed. And I knew that if I didn't do something, that would happen. The house was fighting against itself, trying to prevent that thing from getting out. But at the same time, it was doing everything it could to release whatever was trapped. I didn't know what to do. Fear took over me, and when the thunder finally stopped, the basement fell into silence. A heavy, eerie silence. I went down to the basement and closed the door. I never told my mom or my brother. They never knew what happened that night. I don't know why, but I knew I wouldn't be able to explain it. How could I? The next morning, the house seemed normal again. There were no traces of what happened. The walls were intact, the floor was solid, and nothing seemed out of place. But I knew what had happened. I knew what the house had been trying to do. And since that night, the house has never been the same for me. I never felt like I was alone there again. There was something else, something that hid in the shadows, waiting. I don't know what it was, I don't know why it happened, but something was trapped in the basement, and I fear that one day it could come back. My name is Derek, I'm 38 years old, and I live in a small town in the countryside of Michigan called Hastings. My family and I moved into an old house about 2 years ago, a Victorian-style home that seemed like it was taken straight out of a horror movie. Since it was a quiet town, the place seemed perfect to start a new life away from the hustle and bustle of the big city. Everything seemed fine at first. It was a spacious and charming house with a large garden and many trees surrounding it. I clearly remember the day the storm happened. It was a summer night, but the weather was completely abnormal. The sky was completely covered by dark, threatening clouds, and the wind seemed to swirl in circles, making the branches of the trees creak with a force that made me uneasy. My kids were already in bed, and my wife, Jennifer, was with me in the living room, trying to relax by watching TV. I don't know why, but something about the atmosphere that night made me uncomfortable. When the storm arrived, it was worse than I expected. The sound of the rain hitting the windows was almost deafening. The thunder rumbled loudly, and for a moment I thought the entire house would be ripped from the ground. It was impossible not to notice that there was something strange about that day, as if the very environment was tense, waiting for something. But after a few hours, the rain started to ease, and the wind's noise calmed down. Everything seemed to go back to normal. However, it didn't last long. Around midnight, we started to hear a peculiar sound coming from the attic. At first, there was a thud, like something had fallen, followed by a series of heavy footsteps, but not like normal steps. It was something dragging, as if someone were walking without lifting their feet off the ground. The sound didn't make sense, and the strangest part was that it seemed to be coming from the attic, a space we rarely used. Jennifer and I looked at each other, both trying to understand what was happening. We tried to ignore it, but the feeling of unease only grew. With every step, my stomach tightened more. The sound continued, interrupted by a deep silence that made everything even more unsettling. I can't explain it properly, but the atmosphere felt tense, as if something was watching us. It was impossible to shake off the feeling that we were being watched, but we still didn't do anything right away. We decided that we would check the attic in the morning, but I couldn't stop thinking about what might be up there. When the day finally came, something was wrong. The first thing I did was go down the hallway to the attic door. The key to the attic was always in a drawer in the kitchen, but when I went to get it, it was simply gone. I went to Jennifer, thinking she had taken it to lock the door earlier, but she swore she hadn't touched the key. Strangely, the attic door was locked, but there was no sign that anyone had used the key to close it. It seemed impossible, and the feeling of unease grew stronger. We decided that we would investigate anyway. With the door locked and no key, we tried to force the entry, but it was in vain. The latch was stuck in a way that we couldn't open it. We were starting to get frustrated, but something was still very wrong. The sound from the attic, that dragging of footsteps, didn't stop. It seemed like something or someone was up there, just waiting, staring at us. I spent the next few days trying to come up with a logical explanation for what was happening, but no theory seemed to fit. Jennifer was visibly affected as well. She couldn't stop looking at the attic door, and every time the sound returned at night, her eyes would widen and she would shrink back. She was starting to have nightmares too. In one of those nightmares, she told me she saw a figure standing at the top of the stairs, looking at her with empty and deep eyes. I needed to understand what was going on, so I decided to do something I wouldn't normally do. I researched the history of the house. I found out that the house had a long history of previous inhabitants, but the most peculiar thing was that over 50 years ago, a family had lived there and mysteriously disappeared. I didn't find many details about the case, just a few fragments of old newspapers mentioning a strange incident, but they didn't explain what had happened. In the following weeks, we continued to hear other sounds coming from the attic, but no one was there. One day, while Jennifer was home alone, she called me in a panic, saying she heard someone walking through the house, even though it was completely empty. I was only a few minutes away, so I rushed home, but when I arrived, nothing was out of place. She was trembling, her eyes red, as if she had been crying for hours. She didn't want to be left alone anymore, so we started spending as much time as possible together. The climax came one night when we woke up to the loudest sound of all, coming from the attic. I could no longer ignore the fact that something was very wrong. I grabbed a spare key I found in the drawer and finally managed to open the door. The smell of dust and mold filled the air as soon as the door opened. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heart pounding, and when I reached the top, I found nothing. The attic was empty, except for some boxes and furniture covered in dust. But there was something that kept nagging at me, a strange feeling that someone or something was watching me up there in the dark. As much as I searched for something that would explain the sounds, I found nothing. We decided not to tell anyone about it anymore. We didn't want people to think we were losing our minds, but to this day, I can't stop thinking about it. Sometimes I swear I still hear the heavy footsteps at night coming from the attic. I don't know what happened in that house, but no matter how hard I try to understand, I'll never have an explanation for it. And the strangest thing of all, after a few months the sounds stopped, and the key to the attic, which had vanished, appeared in the kitchen drawer again. I never knew what happened, but since then I avoid even looking at the attic door. I don't know what was up there, but somehow I feel like it's better that I didn't find out.